Sounds good.
Hey, this is Pat Iyer, and this is Legal Nurse Podcast, and I'm talking with Janice McIntosh, who's been a legal nurse consultant for several years. She's been a nurse for over 43 years and has varied experience, including working in home health, gastrointestinal endoscopy, medical surgical, orthopedic, neurologic, and military nursing. And she has been involved in home health services in several states and serves as an expert witness. Janice, welcome to the show.
Hi, Pat. Thank you very much for having me.
What I'd like to do for our listener is to go through some of the ways that you got started in home health. I know that that's an area of healthcare that has changed a lot, especially with people being rotated out of hospitals through that little revolving door as fast as they can get them out, bringing them into the community with a number of serious conditions and treatments. I'm sure it was different when you got started. So can you tell us about how you got into the field?
Sure, Pat. So I got started with home health care back in 1991. True to form of most home care nurses, I started because I wanted to have more control over my schedule, although I had always had an interest in home care. In fact, I even did a capstone project back in my bachelor's degree program. So I've always been interested, but I really just wanted to have more control over when I did visits and what my day looked like. So I was in Mississippi, was transitioning out of the Air Force, and decided to give home care a try. The agency that I started with was one of the reasons why home care became as complex as it has been in regulations and everything, because there was a lot of fraud and abuse going on in that agency. And I really had no idea until I left that agency and went out to my next job. So that part was an eye opener, but it has changed very much over the years. So now there's so many regulations in place that hopefully keep it from that kind of abuse that I saw there.
What kind of abuse did you see?
Well, I didn't even know how to discharge a patient until I left that agency, because they were of the mindset that if you had a patient, they were yours for life, practically.
So I see. That means you could bill for services for life.
Right. So one of the regulations for Medicare has always been that they need to be homebound. And I actually had a lady that I had to schedule my visits with her because she'd go off to the dog track. And so I had to make sure that she was home before I came to do my visits. They also, when you were on call, there was no saying, well, I think you need to go to the emergency room. This sounds like something that I can't solve if I come out and visit you. They would make sure that you went out and got that visit done and then send them off to the hospital. So there was that kind of subtle abuses that went on.
There's always opportunities. It never ceases to amaze me how creative people can be.
Yes, unfortunately, in home care, that was sort of the foundations of what created the documentation nightmare that you see nowadays, is trying to keep track of all of that abuse that happened, and it was difficult to keep track of because it's done in a home. It's not done out in a hospital room where someone's looking over your shoulder. It's done in a home, and so there was a lot of sneaky stuff that could happen.
I believe I told you once, Janice, I was reviewing a case involving a home health aide who took a job in the hospital to become a hospital employee, but she was working with a family, with an elderly woman who needed to be turned and repositioned. And so because the aide was going through orientation, she hired her friend to replace her. And the woman got a pressure sore. And as part of the discovery, when the family decided to sue, they got the orientation sign-in sheets showing that she was in the hospital at the time that she was also signing in to take care of the patient in the home.
Yes. Yeah. And one of the newer regulations that's out there is that agencies now with their scheduling or with their EMRs have to have what's called EVV, which is electronic visit verification. So it actually GPSs where that note was opened. And it GPSs when they closed the note, because there was abuse as far as how long the visit lasted. Were they just there for 5 or 10 minutes, or were they there for an hour? And there's regulations in place as to how long the visit is supposed to happen. So, so there was those difficulties as well. So once again, that created another stopgap.
You worked in Mississippi. I know you worked in several other locations. How long were you in the field before you started doing expert work? And how did you get that first home health care expert witness case?
So I worked probably, I don't know, let's say about 14 years or so. And at that point, I took a legal nurse consulting course. And in part of that legal nurse consulting course, I had, I was listed on a listserv. And I believe it was another nurse that called me and had a case that wanted me to review as an expert. And that case was my first case. It was in 2009. And it was what kind of made me think I can really do this. This is really interesting. It was a case of a diabetic man who had a foot surgery and had an external fixator placed. And he was a little bit non-compliant. Before he left the hospital, he went in the shower, got his dressing all soaked, and the doctor walked in and found his dressing saturated and no one had noticed it. So got the dressing changed. It was documented before he left the hospital that there was no signs of infection. His vitals were all stable. His blood sugar was fine. Then he got home. It was typical home health care discharge. He was discharged on a Friday. He was seen by 3 different nurses over the weekend for daily evaluations. And he was, which sets up the scenario of each nurse doesn't know what it looked like yesterday. Yes. So if you know what it looked like yesterday, you can know, is it getting worse? But each nurse didn't know what it looked like. It showed a steady progression of redness around the pin sites. Didn't look real good. His blood sugar on admission to home care was in the low 100s. And by Sunday, it was up close to 300. And there was no investigation as to whether or not he had eaten something, in his diet that could have elevated his blood sugar. His temperature made a slow rise. It went from like mid 97s to up to 99.8. And he started having some drainage around the pins on Sunday. In the meantime, the doctor was never notified of any of the changes. And the nurse on Sunday decided she was just going to put some antibiotic ointment around the pin sites, which was not in the orders and is not a standard of care for external fixators. And by Monday, the patient himself had called the doctor and ended up in the hospital on IV antibiotics with osteomyelitis and ended up losing, had a partial amputation of his leg. So surprising to me, the attorney had actually had another opinion on it, and I didn't realize it when he gave me the case. But after I told him my findings and why, what my supporting evidence was, then he said, "Great, that exactly matches the other nurse, the national nurse that had evaluated the case." And so it was a plaintiff case, and so they settled, and it was my first taste of being an expert witness, and it was really interesting.
It sounds like it. And it points out the difficulties with the lack of continuity of care, which happens in many settings. I'm thinking of hospital settings where when I worked clinically in med-surg units, I didn't know what the patient looked like the day before. I was working one day here, one day there. You have to have really good documentation, maybe even photographs that somehow can get into the medical record to show the change. And it doesn't sound like they were using a lot of critical thinking in recognizing, especially the elevated blood sugar.
Right.
And pretty big damages to lose your foot. That is a valuable case from the plaintiff attorney's perspective.
Sure. Yes.
And then what led to more cases? Were you getting more cases from the attorney? Was it word of mouth? Were you sought out by other legal nurse consultants?
The one thing that I find with home health care cases is that I do have one attorney firm from Minnesota that I work with fairly routinely. I get 1 or 2 cases a year, but otherwise the home care cases are spread out because I think it has traditionally been in the past that people invite the caregivers into their home, which is one of the reasons why I liked working home health care, because you are in their settings, so you have to work around their their rules and regulations. You can't say, "This is your diet, eat it." You have to tell them, okay, these are the better choices. Let's see what you have in your cupboard. Let's see if this, if we can modify this. But also in inviting you and allowing you into their home, they also feel kind of like you are a friend, and nobody wants to sue a friend. So I find that sometimes there's a hesitancy to want to bring a case against, and they don't realize they're bringing a case against the agency, because it always comes down to, the agency was at fault. And there's, a lot of ways you can point to the fact that it was the agency. It has to do with training. It has to do with orders, that kind of stuff. So yes, the nurse is an agent of the agency. So they're the ones that may have created the problem, but the agency itself is the one that's going to be in litigation. So back to the question. I get them from all over the place. I get them from other nurses that have heard of my work. I get them from attorneys who pass my name along, or on LinkedIn. So there's a variety of different ways that I get the cases, or sometimes I respond when there's a listing out there on LNC Exchange or one of those other sites where they're saying, hey, where's, another LNC says, hey, I'm looking for a home health care nurse. I've responded to those.
Does the regulatory agencies, do they vary much from state to state, or are you responding to federal regulations when you're looking at the standard of care?
That's where it becomes very complicated in home care, because you have so many pipers that are piping the tune. You've got a lot of people you have to dance to. You have CMS, they have overall regulation. You also have state regulations, and then you also have Medicaid regulations. And then if that agency happens to be accredited, it could be Joint Commission, it could be CHAP, which is Oh, I wrote it down. Community Health Accreditation Program, or there's also ACHC, and that's Accreditation Committee for Healthcare. I'm not sure about that. Community for Healthcare. And so they're all different. They've all got a piece of the pie. So they're all, they all have their sets of regulations. I had one that proudly stated on their literature that they were ACHC accredited. Well, in reviewing ACHC regulations, they had not followed the regulations that ACHC had laid out. So, and their argument, it was an argument of well, we don't have these regulations. And when I looked at ACHC, it said specifically they should have these in their policy and procedure book, and they didn't. So it was part of the failure to follow regulations.
I'm thinking about the ways that injuries can occur in home care and the differences between an injury in home care and an injury in the hospital. And it just occurred to me, in the hospital, you have a lot of other sets of eyes who are involved in observing the patient, recording their own information. I'm wondering if you've gotten into cases where what goes on behind that closed door in the house is hard to reconstruct. Does that ever turn out to be a factor for you?
It most often plays into the case because, especially in abuse cases or even something where wound care, whether or not the wound care was done properly, or with sterile technique or clean technique. Quite frequently in home care, you can't achieve sterile technique. You try for clean technique, but you do the best you can. And it's between you and the patient, client, consumer. I've heard them called all different things in each home care agency I've worked with, but it's quite often a he said, she said situation where that person isn't always following the orders the way they're supposed to. And one of the difficulties is that nurses who like and enjoy going into home care situations are frequently independent thinking persons who are really good at on their feet thinking, because when you're in a home care situation, you have to think on your feet. But sometimes that gets you into trouble because those nurses also make a decision without getting orders. So that can be a problem, or without communicating the problems. Like, for instance, the man with the external fixator, she just decided to put antibiotic ointment on there instead of calling the physician, which is what she should have done. So it's difficult sometimes to pin it down. Where are they wrong? Something went wrong, but you have to kind of weed your way through all of the documentation to find what it is that went wrong. So.
And I'm sure you've encountered a lot of challenges regarding going through documentation and figuring out what happened. Is there a case that stands out in your mind that was particularly challenging in terms of figuring out the facts?
I had my most challenging case, I think, at this point was a little baby that was in home care, and it was my the one case that I have actually gone to trial on. Most of the cases I've either just been deposed or not even been deposed. They've settled prior to deposition. But this one, they went all the way to trial, and it was a Hispanic mother and an undocumented father who tried to stay out of the scene because he didn't want to draw any attention to himself. The mother was being blamed for not properly caring for her baby. The baby was had gastroschisis, where the intestines were born on the outside of her stomach when she was born. Spent 4 months in the NICU. Ended up failure to thrive. Was discharged home, and continued to have issues with that at home. The home care nurse came in and was, in my opinion, was looking for trouble. And she just kept trying to say the mom isn't doing things right. She isn't, doing this or doing that. And there were some things that she probably shouldn't have, done the way she did. She did have a history of a seizure disorder, which sort of played into the whole story. The home care nurse was recording weights on a baby scale, and in actual, most of the home care places that I've worked recently, we don't even carry a scales with us because they should be recalibrated each time they're jiggled around in your car. So it's difficult to get an accurate weight. And she would put down that the baby was losing weight, and then she kept documenting, and it was an electronic records where it had the option to say, was the doctor called, yes or no? Well, she kept saying yes, the doctor was called, but there was no indication what the doctor's response was or what kind of message she left or anything like that. So long story short, the baby began crawling, crawled around on the floor and picked up a dime, swallowed it, started having issues about, she was home for probably about 6 months and started having issues. And they did an x-ray, found the coin in the intestine, where she most likely had a stricture. And no one did anything about it for 72 days. And in the meantime, the baby was taken away from the mother, put into a foster home, more or less force-fed, because she was the foster mother was aware that she was being judged by how well this baby gained weight and everything like that. And one day before she was supposed to go to a surgeon for evaluation, she just suddenly went limp in the mother's arms, and they couldn't resuscitate her, and she died. And it was a tragic case because the child had not gained all that much weight in foster care in a month. And in the meantime, she was miserable. She kept screaming while she was being fed. And I mean, it was just pretty much a very sad case. The trial went on for 2 weeks. At the time that I was there, things were going well for the plaintiff. And in the last week, they had the defense brought their experts up. They brought in a pediatric neurologist who opined that the baby had some sort of rare neurological condition that she had died from, based on the fact that there was one entry in the chart that said the baby was noticed to be gazing off in space, sort of like maybe it was having a seizure. The jury bought it, and the trial was decided against the plaintiff. So very sad, difficult to figure out what was going on in the chart. There was a lot of, records. A lot of times in those long-term care cases, there's a lot of information, and you have to just keep weeding through it all the way.
And what was your position about the standard of care? Who were you representing on that case?
I was representing the plaintiff, and I felt that the baby had been removed from the mother for I forget how it was named, but it was basically all the wrong reasons, and that she was not she was not an unfit mother, and that the baby had suffered greatly for going to the foster care.
Mhm. So the defendant was the agency involved in removing the child from the mother? Is that?
Yes, the nurse was involved, and she also knew. She testified that she knew about the coin that was in there. She did not in any way keep saying, this baby keeps throwing up. Are we going to do something about the coin? Part of what a home health care nurse does in a situation is sometimes they act as um, the case manager. So, in fact, a lot of them are called case managers. They kind of orchestrate the whole bunch of doctors and therapists and everything like that. So, her position was, I didn't have to do anything about it. The doctors knew. And it's like, no, you really did need to keep on saying, hey, the baby keeps throwing up. And, it was projectile when she threw up sometimes. And yet she did nothing. She just kept saying the mother wasn't doing stuff right.
Hmm. Did they do an autopsy on the baby? Do you know?
Yes.
And did they determine the cause of death?
Yes, they did. They decided that the coin was acting like a flap in the intestine. Sometimes it would open, sometimes it would close. She had E. coli in her lungs, which meant that she was regurgitating, feces up into her trachea, and that she essentially had died from that. And that, was presented at trial, but it didn't, it didn't persuade the jury. I think by then they had forgotten. So.
Or they heard the physician's theory about
Mhm.
gazing off in space and wanted to believe the medical expert.
Yep.
Sometimes cases are won by the most persuasive expert.
Mm-hmm. That's true. And there was a whole week of, obviously the plaintiff has the right to cross-examine, and I wasn't there for that portion of it, but it sounds like maybe they needed a legal nurse consultant there to help them.
Imagine that.
Imagine that.
You have given us a vivid story of this poor girl and the role of the legal nurse consultant and the expert in helping to evaluate home health cases. How can our viewer or our listener of this podcast reach you if they want to connect with you, or if they have a home health care case and they need a nursing expert?
Sure. So my website is McIntoshLegalNurses.com, and that's McIntosh legalnurses.com. And my email address is jmcintosh legalnurses@gmail.com.
All right. Well, thank you, Janice, so much for sharing your stories and your experiences as a home health care nursing expert. It's been great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much, Pat.
And to you who's been watching this on our YouTube channel or listening to it on the audio stations, thank you for being here and for listening with Janice. You can receive the transcripts of our podcast by going to podcast.legalnursebusiness.com and sign up for the transcripts, and we're happy to provide those for you. Sometimes you hear a show and you want to go back and get the key points and you don't want to re-listen. The transcripts give you that chance to check on the show and refresh your memory on what you just heard or saw. Be sure to be with us next week when we start a new Legal Nurse podcast. And thanks for being here. Hi, this is Pat Iyer with Amanda Love, and we've been speaking with Amanda about her medical condition, which is one of several that legal nurse consultants encounter in medical records. And she shared with us her insights from her perspective as being a person with this condition. Amanda, what were some of the topics that we covered during your podcast?
So we talked about a little bit about my story. We talked about pain management. We talked about how food plays a big role with fibromyalgia. And we talked about that you should never give up with your fibromyalgia journey.
All right. Thank you so much, Amanda. And be sure to catch Amanda Love's podcast for some insider tips on managing fibromyalgia. Thanks.